I figured out what love feels like for someone who is an extreme avoidant. Now, most of the time when one of my peers takes on this subject, they're really looking at the major signs that an avoidant falls in love with you. But we're not going to do that today. Instead, I want to take you into the mind of an avoidant so you can understand what's going on and look at how they process the world from their perspective. So take, for example, this little nugget of knowledge. Did you know that an avoidant will really have two waves of love? So the first wave is going to happen during a relationship, and the second wave is going to happen after the relationship has already ended. So that's really how I'd like to divide this video up. Basically looking at these two separate love waves that are going to happen to an avoidant and help you understand what they look like through those avoidance eyes. Let's start with the first wave, love at the beginning of a relationship. So when I'm researching videos like this, the first thing I tend to always do is go to forums because I'm really interested to see what people have to say in general. And what's really interesting is when I went to forums to try to understand what the general consensus was on how avoidants feel love, often I'll find myself having two reactions. The first reaction is pretty simple. I'll look at something, I'll say, wow, that person made a really good point. I'm gonna have to make sure that I discuss that on the video. Or the second reaction, which is I'll roll my eyes and say this person has no idea what they're talking about. And for some odd reason, when I was researching avoidant love, I found myself rolling my eyes a lot because there's a lot of misinformation out there. So take, for example, this specific comment that I got from Quora, the forum. This person doesn't really even answer the original question, which was revolving around, hey, what does it feel like for an avoidant to feel in love? Instead, this person just says, run, just run, avoid the avoidant and find yourself someone who can actually love you. Seriously, stop trying to figure them out and cut off all contact. These people don't change. They leave a wake of misery behind them and are all too happy to leave you in it too. Run and don't look back. So essentially this person's saying, run from avoidance, they are not capable of love, and they don't change. And that's a huge problem because almost everything said there is not true. Number one, avoidants are capable of love. Number two, avoidants can actually change. And I think one of the worst raps that avoidants get is the simple fact that most people do think that they're incapable of love, when in reality they are. They've just never been shown a way to love healthily, if that makes any sense. And that really leads me to my next point, which has to do with how avoidants tend to label love. So the big mistakes that avoidants tend to make is they actually assume love is the honeymoon period. They confuse the two. So in other words, they grow addicted to the way that they feel during a honeymoon period. When you initially get into a relationship with someone, it's really great. But the honeymoon period never lasts forever. And so what ends up happening is when the honeymoon period inevitably ends, the avoidant thinks that they've fallen out of love with you. And though I've not been able to find reputable research backing up what I'm about to say, it's just a theory of mine, I do have an idea for why they do this. So I'm gonna call this the first time is the best time theory. Now, life is set up in a way that when we have an experience, the first time we experience it, it's going to have the biggest emotional impact, either positively or negatively. And oftentimes, the big example I'll use to illustrate this point is with movies. So obviously the first time you see a movie, it's going to pack the biggest emotional punch. The character arcs are going to pay off for you. But what about the fifth time you see that same movie? It could still be really awesome, don't get me wrong, but it's still not going to affect you the way it did potentially the first time that you had the experience. This is a rule of life. This occurs with pretty much everything you can imagine. And it can go both ways. Sometimes it can feel positive when you have a good experience. Sometimes it can feel negative when you have a negative experience. But the more experiences you acquire, the less it's going to feel more positive or negative, if that makes any sense. So avoidants inherently understand this. And this is actually why I think, or can partially explain why avoidants are drawn so much to the honeymoon period. They fall in love with that first time as the best time. And if you've ever been in a honeymoon period with more than one person, you can kind of sympathize or rather empathize with what they're going through. They like the feelings that the honeymoon period can provide the first time, but as it wears off, it becomes lessened each time they feel it with a new person. And it can even go deeper than that. The honeymoon period in and of itself is still going to feel great with a new person, but there's also a finite end to it. And the honeymoon period in and of itself can almost serve as like this doomsday clock for them, which is exactly what they want. For an avoidant, having an out in a relationship is perfect. So they'll enter into a relationship, they'll suck up the honeymoon period as much as they possibly can. When the honeymoon period ends, they leave the relationship. The doomsday clock has struck 12, it is time to leave. And then they rinse and repeat over and over and over again. But their thinking and their approach to it is a little flawed because remember, like I said, the more you experience the honeymoon period with new people, the less effective it becomes at potentially moving you, so to speak. And looking at love in this way, it becomes almost like a crutch. And I can actually say I'm guilty of this. I've been diagnosed as a dismissive avoidant, so ironically, I'm probably the best person to tell you what it feels like for an avoidant to be in love. So I'll tell you a story. My first breakup scarred me so mentally that I was single for 5 years. And it was a conscious choice. I could have easily had multiple girlfriends, but because I was so scarred from that experience and because attachment styles can change based on your relationships with other people, I found it safer to remain single, to remain inward. But that doesn't mean that I didn't go on dates or play the field. I certainly did. And one of my favorite things to do was go on a date, kind of experience the honeymoon period, and then once I felt the emotions and felt satisfied with them, I would end a relationship before it even began and move on to the next person. Cycle and cycle and cycle again. Now I did this for my own protection. I didn't want to get close to anyone else. I didn't want to feel the heartache and pain that the first breakup left me reeling with. So I'm hardly the first person to do this. And it kind of gives you some insight into what it feels like for an avoidant to be in love, but it's not the whole story. Remember, there's 2 waves. So you have the initial wave of the honeymoon period and that part and during the relationship, but then there's the wave after the relationship, and that's where things get really complicated. So my entire thought process around the wave 2, after the relationship is over, revolves around the avoidant Phantom X syndrome. Now, if you haven't watched my video on the avoidant Phantom X syndrome, I highly recommend that you check that out right now. And I wish I could claim credit for coming up with it, but the truth is I stumbled across the concept after I read an article from a website called freetoattach.com. And in freetoattach.com, embedded in the body of the article, probably in the middle of it, is this quote. An avoidant person often has a story of a perfect ex in a relationship that wasn't fully realized, the one that got away, to whom no one else can measure up. In reality, the idealized relationship was often lackluster or insecure and unlikely to be highly functional. So just like an avoidant will confuse love with the honeymoon period, they can also confuse love in the post-breakup period with the avoidant Phantom X syndrome. They create sort of this one that got away loop that they actually want to be stuck in. Because remember, avoidants exist with this really strange paradox where they do want love, but they are scared to let anyone close enough to give them that love. So for them, any relationship that seems like it's going to be in limbo or perpetual limbo is ideal. And there's nothing more ideal than the one that got away. Someone that they can daydream about and kind of touch the edges of a honeymoon period again without actually having to go into a relationship at all. In other words, they'd rather have a pretend fantasy relationship than a real one. And this actually explains why in the post-breakup period with an avoidant, if you want a reconciliation to ever happen, you're the one that has to do most of the work, because at best an avoidant is just going to give you a look to say that they're interested in, but there's no way that you'll ever know or figure out how to decipher the look. Believe me, I've tried. And we actually do have research to back this up. So I ran a poll in our private Facebook support group asking people, hey, for those of you who've completed a no contact rule, how many of your exes actually reached out to you? And over 60% of the people said that their exes did not reach out. When you couple that with the fact that most of our clients' exes are avoidant, it kind of makes sense and lends credence to the idea that you're gonna have to do most of the work in the post-breakup period. Once again, the relationship in the avoidant's head is a lot more preferable to the one in real life. But where things get incredibly confusing with the Phantom X syndrome has to do with long-term prospects versus short-term prospects. So the Phantom X syndrome revolves around the one that got away. But what if I were to tell you that you can have a long-term one that got away and a short-term one that got away, and sometimes simultaneously at once? It's complicated, right? But think of it like this. Imagine you are dating me. Again, you should be so lucky. I'm a dismissive avoidant. I have, all throughout a relationship, in my head, this person, this Phantom X that I'm thinking about, the one that got away. And I'm always comparing you in our relationship to this person. It's a mechanism that I'm using to keep you afar, to keep you from stomping on my independence. Now, this person that is the Phantom X, it really wasn't that great of a relationship. In fact, I'm mostly misremembering it and thinking only of the positives and kind of neglecting the negatives. But the truth is, you can never measure up to this person because they don't exist. It's a figment of my imagination. It's also the long-term Phantom X. So essentially, it's the one Phantom X that I use with every new relationship to ensure that that person doesn't ever get super close to me. But we go through a breakup. I break up with you, I leave, whatever. And you become my short-term Phantom X. So yes, at once, an avoidant can have two types of Phantom X's. They'll have the long-term Phantom X and the short-term Phantom X. And the short-term Phantom X, I include it because it could be the one that finally knocks the long-term one off the pedestal. But the aim is almost always the same. The avoidant intends to create a scenario where they can keep you at bay, where they can hold off commitment, because commitment to them threatens their independence. In the end, this much is true. Love is a very complicated affair for an avoidant.